Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Entry Level Left. If you value the content we create and want access to exclusive bonus episodes, please consider supporting us on patreon.com at patreon.com/entry-level-left. We also post memes, news, and current events on our Facebook page at Entry Level Left. Our link tree in the About section of our Facebook page has links to every platform that you can find us on, and you can find us on twitter.com at entry-level-left as well.
All right, everyone. So today we're talking Mark Fisher's seminal text, Capitalist Realism. Today, I'm Jared.
I'm Matt.
I'm Nathan.
And we're going to get into this very, very important yet short book from Mark Fisher today. So the first question I would pose to the group to kind of give some background information to our listeners who have never read the book. What is capitalist realism and why is it relevant today?
So just going by what he even states, he basically says that, capitalist realism is sort of his conception of postmodern capitalism, which in a less jargony sense, for our listeners, he basically means that capitalist realism is the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable option for us in the present and moving forward, but it's impossible for us to even imagine an alternative to the current state of capitalism on the global scale that it is at today. And so, with that, it encompasses a whole number of things, including how we feel about the ways in which we interact with each other in society more broadly, and how we conceptualize our places, here both mentally, materially, and so on.
Yeah, and I would say specifically to this concept of capitalist realism, it also bears with it this concept of really eking out what the neoliberal class project has created for society, but in a very psychological, in a very realist sort of way. But the basic idea that people need to grasp for what capitalist realism is just this overwhelming or pervasive sense of how capitalism has rendered us incapable of creating new ideas, and that we're merely just stuck in a cycle of regurgitating the old.
Yeah, it's really about an increasing lack of imagination that we have about thinking about what could be different, especially when it comes to capitalism. And obviously, we've said this quote before, but he distills it perfectly using the Zizek/Jameson quote. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, which to its core just essentially means that we are more stuck on things like thinking about apocalypse movies or imagining what it would be like if the world were to come to nuclear winter or environmental collapse than we are about actually thinking of different alternatives. And you can see that, and this is what Mark Fisher kind of does, and similar to what kind of Zizek does, is kind of looks at a lot of media and uses that to kind of gauge our anxieties. So throughout the book, he uses a whole lot of different examples about how these scenarios that we see in movies or even just specific scenes kind of relate to how we feel as a culture about certain subjects.
Right. I would definitely say for sure that it is a cultural critique, mainly in this book. And you can look no further than the first page where they're talking about a movie reference or things like that. So it's very contemporary. Definitely worth a read, even if you listen to this episode and feel like you get something out of it. We'd still very much recommend reading the book. So to dive a little bit deeper into this concept of capitalist realism in this book, Fisher discusses how capitalist realism, in an effort to stay dominant, will often perform anti-capitalism for us. How might neoliberal capitalism perform anti-capitalism for us? And how successful has this been?
Yeah, so, one of the ways is actually something we talked about on a much earlier episode when we were talking about the kind of capitalism in the environment. And, one of the things we talked about is how a lot of kind of woke environmentalism will talk about just, or not even woke environmentalism, but green capitalism will just be buy these products versus that product. And I think that, in this case, one way in which capitalism performs the anti-capitalism for us is that it sort of says, it actually broadly out in the open will identify specific corporations or enterprises that are the quote unquote bad guys, and
Right.
all we have to do to combat them is, rather than buy their nasty, dirty products, their bad products, their products that are, destroying the environment, using child slave labor overseas, et cetera, all we have to do is just buy from the good guys, the good products, that
Right.
make us feel good. And therefore, in that sense, we're kind of participating in capitalism while believing we're participating in this form of anti-capitalism.
Right. And it's kind of highlighted too in this like resist, this very like liberal resist, #resist movement, how it's like this concept that we'll get into a little bit later, but this concept of inter-passivity, where we are allowed to kind of speculate into, anti-capitalism, but it's like the capitalist media is performing that analysis for us. So the particular example that Fisher provides in the book would be the movie, Disney Pixar movie WALL-E. So the irony of that movie is like the audience is kind of being forced to grapple with this post-apocalyptic conception of the earth and corporations and how they're interacting with each other. But the irony is just that, the movie is trying to prod people into this sort of like, I don't know, latent sense of anti-capitalist sentiment. But realistically, you're really participating in it by watching the movie. And so this is the concept of inter-passivity. The media, or the medium of the capitalist ideology, in this case, the movie, the Pixar movie, is doing in some sense like some type of anti-capitalist virtue signaling or signaling or messaging to us. So we're more, I guess we're more lax about letting that go by the wayside, like letting that radical sentiment go by the wayside. And this concept is something that, Fisher describes as inter-passivity. Which is essentially capitalism doing the anti-capitalism for us so that we can continue consuming with impunity. So consuming without a care in the world about what we're affecting and how. And that's kind of like really encapsulates, I feel, this concept of capitalist realism. And we'll get into it more. But just this idea that, you have impunity to continue consuming. But realistically, if you were to dig deeper, you are part and parcel to the problem. You know what I mean? And you don't think that way because you're literally just watching a movie, right? But, when these things accumulate into cultural processes, they become complacency. They become, ways out for us to really challenge the structures. And then later in the book, Fisher goes on to describe this as the height of ideology, the height of capitalist propaganda, to essentially make you feel like there's no need for a subjectively held belief for you to carry these things or operate within this inter-passivity or this capitalist realism.
One of the sort of reoccurring themes in the book, again, is like this feeling of being trapped within a capitalist perspective. And I think really early on in the book, one of the really great examples he brings up is Kurt Cobain. And this sort of he kind of uses him as a way to explain why, even if you can acknowledge the problems with the system, and it doesn't really matter, not necessarily capitalism, but just in general, if you're looking at something like MTV, right? For Kurt Cobain, there's a few different forms he can exist in. He can accept MTV and just, play by their standards.
Yeah.
He can resist it, which is already a cliche on its own, and in the end, just sells more records for somebody, probably MTV too, And then third, he can recognize that and try to point that out to people. But again, at this point in his life, at this point in history, that itself has become a cliche. So there's no way to actually really escape this sort of like capitalist realist perspective. Even if you acknowledge that it exists, there's no way to actually get outside of it. Another example that he brings up is like, people who can acknowledge sort of the fiat status of money. We can all look at it and say, well, this is just paper.
Right.
But does that stop that person from using money like it's a magical,
or treating
it has
it as
magical
such?
properties?
Yeah, because the society incentivizes them to act as if it matters more than anything. And that's one thing he talks about too in the book is like, we act as if money isn't all important, but we worship it like a god. And through our actions, we are showing more about how subversive capitalist ideology is than it really appears to be in society.
Right. Like what I mean is like we can literally hold the dollar right now and say like, this doesn't matter because it's just paper. But at the same time, when we walk into a store and they're like, are you going to pay for that? We're like, oh yeah, here we go. Here's the magical thing that makes it all okay that I walk out with this drink or this product or whatever.
Right.
So it has its own like almost occult properties to it.
Yeah. And I actually want to give just one more, even more contemporary example before we move on. There was a documentary made, and it was called American Factory, and it's talking about how in the Rust Belt in America, I guess post-industrial Ohio, there's like some Chinese billionaire who comes in, starts up a factory, and it's this whole critique of just giant moneyed interests and capitalism and blah blah. And the people who directed it, when they accepted their award they won an Oscar for this documentary, the woman goes up there and she's like, oh, workers of the world unite. Well, we all know that to be a Marx quote, right?
Yeah.
So she's up here, she's saying this anti-capitalist thing. It's perceived as an anti-capitalist documentary. There's just a few things though underneath that sort of relate to this thing that we're talking about in terms of capitalism performing anti-capitalism for us. This is a documentary, number one, released on Netflix, one of the most popular Netflix documentaries. Number two, the company that I guess produced it or made it or whatever is under the Obama Foundation's umbrella. So not only that, the Obama Foundation is profiting off of this. And we all know Obama to be one of the more modern archetypes, or architects rather, of the neoliberal, world order. And so here is this contemporary manifestation of, I watched this documentary, I feel I'm more aware of this anti-capitalist thing, I'm very woke on this, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, like, all that serves is for you to have something to, preach about or talk about with other people, but it doesn't lead to any material change to the status quo.
Right.
You might even like look at podcast as a similar type of thing where like at first it starts off as a very like DIY, like everybody speak your mind type of thing. And slowly it's moved to a more like corporate structure where people like NPR or like iHeartRadio or whoever have these podcasts. And a lot of them are pretty like quote unquote radical in ways, they're very critical. But again, it's sort of weird that we have corporations that own a radical political podcast. Like how does that work? From a honest perspective.
Well, one of the most important things that I took from like the early chapters of the book would be this idea that there's no punctual moment of disaster when you're looking at this concept or this example like WALL-E. There's no like real punctual moment of disaster in the sense that people are recognizing like how imminent climate change or climate catastrophe could be. It's like the ideology of capitalism is so insidious that it gets us to act with inter-passivity about things that are, really, really important and imminent disasters for us. And this is like what I find so insidious is just the complacency that creates within people.
Yeah. So, just kind of moving on here, in some of the later kind of more midsection chapters, one of the things Mark Fisher talks about is how this sort of broader ontology of capitalist realism has, kind of convinced us that even the ethos of capitalism is sort of like that businesses are good and efficient at what they do. Therefore, everything needs to be run in this fashion. Right. Everything needs to be run like a business, like the private sector would. So with that and him talking about this, how do we see this doctrine actually playing out today? How does it encroach on the political, the economic, that sort of thing?
So we've talked about this in the past with like the neoliberal project, but I think the concept about everything functioning better or smoother as a business is very much a capitalist, subjectively held belief. But the irony is that Fisher talks about the role of capitalist ideology. But the role of capitalist ideology is not to make an explicit case for something in the way that propaganda does, but to conceal the fact that the operations of capital do not depend on any sort of subjectively assumed belief. And look no further than this concept of the fact that, or this idea that everything would run better as a business or a business type of operation. Realistically, that's not true. And it's just kind of irony to me to see how capitalist ideology functions, and its prime purpose being to conceal that there is a need for like subjectively held beliefs, when there totally is. Like, you need to have a subjectively held belief that is not objective, that is not comparable or able to be contrasted with reality or mapped onto reality, to believe that capitalism is this all-consuming system, that we can go no further, that there's no alternative. These are things that you need to be believing, and that's the insidiousness of it again, is that they try to make you think with the propaganda that there is no need to have a subjectively held belief, that capitalism is just the default. But again, the irony is that, these are subjectively held beliefs about how things should operate that realistically don't show efficiency in the real world. Like how, for example, they want to, like the right wing wants to privatize or gut the USPS, but the USPS was profitable until the government changed a policy that then caused them to be less profitable. So we see in real time how this ideology that like a business, orientation towards everything is not always the proper way objectively to run things.
Yeah, one thing that I want to point out, and you kind of already said it, was that it is largely a myth that there is less bureaucracy in capitalism. You know, throughout later parts of the book, he does go like strictly into detail in many ways how it makes it more bureaucratic. And so I think it's almost like a non-question. It's like, hey, like it doesn't. So
Right.
why does this exist? It's because it's a mythology that's created by capitalists to essentially sell their ideology,
Yeah.
And so kind of going back to the like subjectivity that you're talking about, made earlier in the book was a point that the ideology of capitalism itself is postmodernism, that there actually is like no specific sort of like wrong answer to what is right when it comes to capitalism. And I think that's like a huge part that he's sort of subtly criticizing throughout the book. And at the end, even though he has made a lot of references to some of these more sort of postmodern type thinkers, at the end, you can tell it's sort of a rejection of that there is sort of like a basic need for us to discuss what our core values are and act on them.
Right. Well, I think too, kind of going to what, Matt was talking about as an example, is it's like it's very easy for the capitalist class and under a capitalist realist system, which sort of is like this sort of end of history notion. There is no alternative at the moment. And, it's very easy to hold the belief that, well, if we run everything as a business, it'll be more efficient, when all of the public sector things like the USPS, like Amtrak, have been so defunded over the years that their operational capacity to perform like an Amazon or whatever is non-existent. So therefore, it's easy for these people to step in and say, okay, well, clearly what we need to do now is privatize all of it. And we've seen what happens when, that occurs, and we'll kind of get more into this later with what you were talking about, the bureaucracy thing, is because if you look at the US, like our healthcare system, it's already privatized and it's not more efficient at doing what it is, what it's supposed to do. All it does is make things more expensive. And when you need to file a claim for something or whatever, they send you to 12 different call centers that shift you around, which their sole purpose is trying to give you as little as possible.
And that's the bureaucracy.
Exactly.
That's where the bureaucracy
it
comes
develops its whole superstructure within this that governs over this ethos, this ontology, this whole network of things that contribute to the capitalist realist reality.
Right. So ontology being like where things come from, or this idea of understanding where this concept, this culture comes from, and then the ethos of capitalism being, competition, free markets. These are the ethics of how capitalism performs and seeks new markets and seeks to, this is why it's so resilient. This is why, the magic of capitalist ideology is not to make an explicit case for something, like I said, in the way that propaganda does, but to literally conceal the fact that operations of capital like don't depend on any sort of subjectively assumed belief, like we've talked about. But even more so, capitalism actually relies on the disavowal or contradictory behavior. Though, like we talked about with the money concept, we're taught, that money is the root of all evil and all of these things. But
or it's not everything.
It's not everything. But then our actions show that we worship money almost kind of like an idol. And so this contradictory behavior, this disavowal, creates cultural issues. It creates social issues, and Fisher goes on to talk about later, which we'll get into, how it affects, people and mental health, bureaucracy, how all of these things synthesize to really affect people. But ultimately, the final thing that I wanted to broach in this particular section was just the way that all of this structures things socially. And beliefs about money, for example, not influencing behavior, this kind of creates like an unconscious fantasy that structures our social reality. And this isn't the only example. Like money and the way that we act towards it isn't the only example. But it's good to sink your teeth into that one to kind of understand how we've become almost post-ideological. And that's kind of what Fisher gets at when he quotes Zizek in the book. And I'm sure that people listening to the show may have friends and relatives that they tend to be very post-ideological. Like you can talk to them about your ideology or politics, and they kind of just like, they'll allow you to talk about it and not really feel like it is overshadowing or overpowering what they believe, because capitalism, in a sense, in a cultural sense, with these concepts and these pressures that we've talked about, the insidiousness of it is really just how it gets us to overlook how ideology can, reflect real things in society. And so that's where the unconscious, unthinking element of the ideology, the propaganda comes in, is it gets us to really disengage almost with our reality. And that really is what people need to understand about capitalist realism, is it's a new real. The reality is supplanting real.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And we'll talk about that later. But the concept in the book is that what is real is any reality, is whatever the reality has to suppress. So, we may act in a certain way under capitalism, but our beliefs are completely disavowed from the system. And that just, really contributes to that concept of inter-passivity, like we talked about. So with that said, Fisher coins the term liberal communism to describe many ways in which the market adapts in lucrative ways that sound democratic in principle. What is liberal communism, and how do we see it playing out today?
Yeah, so, we don't have to spend too much time on this point, but I really just wanted to bring it up for our listeners because it really reminds me of something we talked about on our, I think, second or first episode, maybe, the, socialism versus capitalism. Yeah. Because one of the things we talked about in that episode was how capitalism was this revolutionarily amoral system that is so able to adapt quickly and efficiently to the times. And, we've kind of already been discussing this. We've talked about how it's adapted its own version of anti-capitalism to get you to feel like you're performing anti-capitalism.
Yeah.
But one of the ways that, he talks about this, and it just resonated with me, is he says liberal communism is kind of how the new capitalism operates. And when he says liberal in this context, he doesn't mean like the liberal we talked about in liberalism versus the left. He means liberal like market liberalism, like free market private liberalism. So you could almost say, instead of liberal communism, free market communism, which sounds like a total oxymoron. Yeah. But when you think about what he's talking about, what he's saying is like how under this system, for instance, you have open borders. But what do we mean by open borders under this? We don't mean the free flow of people. We mean the free flow of capital. How you can get money.
Investment.
You can get money and finance and investment from New York to Singapore in seconds. He talks about how there is a class war that exists, but not in the Marxian sense where it's the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. In this sense, the proletariat is completely pacified, seemingly non-ideological, and the only class war that exists is from the ruling class, the capitalist class, against the proletariat.
Yeah.
He talks about how we see the withering away of the state, but not in the Marxist sense. In this sense, all of the sort of social welfare, the welfare state has been stripped, and the only remnants of the state is to perform militaristic and policing functions. And he states this quote that says, "Workers have been liberated from their bondage, but left stranded in the desert with no idea where to go." And I think that's such a good quote, because even if you take in this notion of like Uber Lyft, it almost has this very Marxian principle. No bosses. You know, you're your own boss.
Create your own schedule.
Yeah, create your own schedule.
The illusion of democracy and control.
You own the wealth that you produce. But in reality, it's like you own all of the risk. And yes, you drive around for 8 hours a day and you make some money.
But that's your car wear and tear. That's your gasoline.
And they're siphoning off their little piece of the pie. So what you're getting here is just it's just so amazing to me, because in a you know, deeply kind of sinister way, but it's so amazing to me because I just think of that initial episode when we were talking about the ability of capitalism to be so adaptable to everything, you know, and because of that, it's no wonder that we're left with this capitalist realist reality of it seeming like there's no alternative. Because even when you adopt what you think to be a radical principle or a radical idea under this system, the system just takes all of the rhetoric and co-opts it and turns it into its own its own version of that. And even just one more thing, sorry, I don't mean to go too long, but even one more thing is like, you know, that an issue I've kind of grown on since we last talked about it is when we were talking about abolishing the police. Sounds great, sounds radical. Well, what happens when you try and take that radical notion under capitalism? Well, sure, they'll abolish the police and they'll replace it with a private police force. You know what I mean? How much do you pay for your little own personalized death squad?
Yeah, the structure will never really change.
Right.
It's always going to be in protection of private property as an imperative over human life, over these things. And really, just to go back to the liberal communism thing, definitely sounds like an oxymoron. But just think, for our listeners, like, think people like Bill Gates, think like these big philanthropist entrepreneur people, even Soros to a degree. Like,
no, definitely.
You know,
definitely.
I hope we don't lose some of our funding from this.
Right.
But yeah, like these type of people, what their goals are seem to be democratic in principle, but what they're really trying to do is to create systems that just like make people depend on their infrastructure anyway.
Right.
So it's just like the liberalizing of communism almost. So think about it that way. Like, you're taking all of these resources, all of this, like, you know, philanthropy that Bill Gates does in Africa, and you think of that in a democratic way, but really what it's doing is just creating dependence, you know. And we've gone back and I think an episode and talked about Thomas Sankara, and how, you know, his concept was like he didn't want seeds or food or other things from other nations. He wanted plows and different things that they could be self-sufficient with. And so this liberal communist idea, or this idea of liberal communism, is really something that you have to understand in context of these like philanthropist billionaire people who really they appear as if they're creating a more democratic, more more opportunities for people, but really what they're doing is creating networks of dependence.
Yeah, I mean, liberal communism is sort of like an extension of that reconfiguration that we were talking about. A lot of people talk about, like David Harvey and stuff, how neoliberalism is a reconfiguration of traditional forms of capitalism, and there will probably be future forms, reconfigurations, like social democracy or, you know, authoritarianism, like Mark Fisher talks about in the book when he's talking about the movie Children of Men. It's like, it's still a capitalist structured society, but they've completely changed the way that it's governed. You know, it's now normal to have guards on every single corner with machine guns and terrorists blowing things up, but we're all still going to coffee shops to buy, fucking a $5 latte.
Right.
It's how can those things like coexist? It sounds absurd, but that's the point of capitalist realism is that it's almost impossible to escape this mindset
Right.
that this is just normal. And what's good, sort of kind of like what you brought up about liberal communism and me describing it as a reconfiguration of capitalism in a small way, is that it encourages like this culture of forgetting, right? We're told forever, for years, decades and decades, that it has to be this way because this is just how the world works, right? It's not ideological. Like it's not like it's just take it for granted that
Or
this
it's
is
just business.
This is how it works. This is just business, And then suddenly things do change, Suddenly we become authoritarian, or we become a social democracy, or we take on these sort of like liberal communist sort of characteristics, and then we're like, well, how can we change it like that? But we can't change it for the good, right? There's always that one consistent element of capital is being extracted from the workers, right? That part doesn't change. Everything else around that will change, but that's the one value that has to remain consistent. And what's interesting is that, in the book, Fisher later on, I think it's like chapter 7, talks a little bit about how we've created a culture of forgetting, where we suddenly are just totally okay with things that would have been unacceptable in the past. Like, for example, the privatization of railroads, which is huge in England. These things that are now suddenly normal were not normal at all at one point.
Yeah.
And the problem that happens in the individual mind is that you can't say that this was an absolute truth because suddenly it's no longer true anymore.
Right.
So you have to actually almost forget that was ever a quote unquote truth of our society.
Yeah.
Right.
And so capitalism creates this sort of like cultural anxiety of forgetting. And that's, causes tension, of course, like we talked about with the mental health and stuff that we'll probably get into in a little bit.
Well, just to highlight that absurdity even more is like, I'm sure y'all have been hearing about how in Oregon, like protesters are being captured by, non-federal agents and being abducted. But this is the type of stuff like this surveillance state, this increased security, increased militarization of police.
Right.
These are things that start to creep up on you.
Yeah.
And then, they're just kind of normalized.
Yep.
But what liberals don't understand is like these, people that are abducting these protesters may be connected to Trump, but Obama set the legal precedent for them to be allowed to be abducted for these things.
Right.
And I think I just posted a meme about it on the Facebook page today. But it's like what you're talking about is so true, Nathan. Is like that forgetting. It's almost like a cultural thing that we are just like, we're inundated, we're bombarded with so much stuff, and this is really going to lead into what we're going to talk about with mental health, but we're bombarded with this shit, and we're constantly forced to forget almost.
Yeah, and you can imagine, like, that's a great example, because you could imagine, like, in 2005, if we were talking to the general public and we were like, hey, so we're going to have some protests, and there's going to be some people that are going to show up, and they're not really from any specific agency, and they have no markings or anything like that. Nobody knows who they are. They're just going to pick people up, not charge them, and just relocate them. We would probably be, I mean, everybody, I'm talking Democrats, Republicans, radicals, whatever, would all probably be like, no, absolutely not unacceptable. But now all of a sudden we're like, well, no, in 2020, we're like, maybe it's acceptable. I could see a few reasons, and slowly, like you said, there's this creep, and we again have to go into this cycle of just forgetting. Like, oh, we once had that one principle that we thought we would just never be able to let go, but we did, because there has to be some sort of consistency, and that consistency is again just capital,
Yeah.
Well, and also too, it's like when people on the left, even just more of the like soc dem, left, were saying shit like abolish ICE. That was taken as an absolutely radical, insane idea. But all three of us were alive when ICE never didn't exist.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? And we're only 25, 26, 27. Like we're not. It's not like we're, old, super old or anything. Like ICE literally is younger than we are, and yet to even say abolish ICE in this post
radical,
post 9/11, post or capitalist realist reality, where we view that as like, oh, this is just insane.
Yeah, and again, the insidiousness is kind of encapsulated in this idea that this is all architected, like culturally, for us to forget, for us to constantly recede in our values, to constantly recede in our ethics and morals, and allow capital to establish dominance over the very things that we value and believe.
Right.
And, understand ethically, how we navigate the world. And that's why it's so sinister, like you said. It's all consuming, like a Leviathan, like we talked about in one of our earlier episodes.
Yeah, so I mean, with all that said, kind of what we were talking about earlier, contrary to private sector promises, Fisher discusses heavily how increasing bureaucracy has taken over all means of life under the current capitalist, moment.
Yeah.
In order to serve this sort of capitalist big other that he talks about in referencing Zizek. How does this reality manifest itself today? How do we see this increased bureaucracy, this big otherism happening under capitalism today?
Yeah. So I kind of just see the way I look at capitalism and the superstructure of it, how it maintains itself ideologically. I look no further than places like Twitter, the Twittosphere.
Right.
You've got people like Elon Musk. You've got all types of entrepreneurs. You got individuals, just individuals. We go back to that Thatcher quote. There is no society. No society, just individuals and families.
Right.
And this is really the encapsulation of neoliberal capitalism. We talked about reconfiguring these ideas. Well, capitalism initially, regardless of what it was supposed to be, has now been reconfigured into almost like a cultural class project that has changed and reconfigured the way that we look at not only society, but ourselves. And so with that in mind, these figures in the Twittosphere, big media, Hollywood, they have an effect on how we look at ourselves and what we set our goals to be, how we look at our values, all of these things. And how I see this going into bureaucracy is just, it creates a system where people have no, and we'll talk about this later, but they have no wherewithal. They're directionless, like you said, and they're in the desert. They've been dropped off. They sit between this concept of like a post-disciplinarian framework where they're just out of high school or they're just out of institutional learning centers, and they're now asked to be consumers of services. So how do you straddle that position where you were once a ward of the state, a disciplined person or creature of the state, educational institutions, and now your position that you've become a 20-something, you're in your first apartment, blah, blah, blah. You straddle this position or this role in society where you're now supposed to consume services. You're supposed to be a good consumer, supposed to be a smart consumer, and you're supposed to just, exist on buying crap for the rest of your life. You're supposed to climb the corporate ladder. And with that, this social reality that we've constructed under capitalism, this farcical, mystical, mythological bullshit that we tell ourselves and we believe creates almost a sense of bureaucracy in and of itself, because we're all told to, now that we're straddling this position or this role in society, what the hell do we do? And this bureaucracy arises from this confusion, the proletarian being dumped in the desert with no real direction. We're told all of these things about philosophical ideas of the good life, but the bureaucracy, the framework that we're put in, it makes us look at the good life or eudaimonia in a very specific way. And that in and of itself creates bureaucracy.
Yeah, I like he has a really quick way of explaining bureaucracy in one of the sections, and I think it's relating to the one about the call center, right? Which is just a great example. It's like, if everything goes fine, you don't need them. It doesn't matter. But as soon as something goes wrong, suddenly you realize how deep this bureaucracy goes. You'll be amazed that anything gets done. That's an exact quote from the book. He's like, if you had this type of situation, you would just be dumbfounded that literally anything can change when you speak to somebody at a call center. And I think I had an example last week that happened to somebody I know that was a great example of this sort of like structure of disavowal that Mark Fisher describes bureaucracy as. And it's actually what happened last week was that I know somebody who had their car got hit, right? And the person actually took off, the person who hit them, right? So what happens is, you have the cops show up, they take a look, right? Yeah. And he tells you, I mean, it's not really much we can really do about this, if you're going to make a claim, it's going to affect your insurance and everything like that. So I don't really know. Do you really want a police report? Do you really want to kind of go down this route?
Right.
And if you talk to this cop, he would probably say like, No, I like justice. Justice is a good idea, you know? People shouldn't be able to just do wrong things like hit somebody and leave, you know? But at the same time, he's telling you not to make a big deal of it, you know, to just let it go.
That's literally happened to me before.
Well, yeah, it's happened to me before too, but that's funny that you say that, Nathan, because what I'm thinking is the bureaucracy in your example is literally creating a disavowal of the society that we're living in. It's going and contributing to this fantasy idea, this fantasy reality that we've structured.
So the individual has something inside of him that is saying, I must do it this way, although ideologically I don't really agree with it, you know? And then, you know, you take it to the next step. Well, what about the insurance company? Well, why does the insurance company have to charge you more if someone hit your car?
Right.
How does that work? Well, you know, it's not the insurance agent's fault. It's not his boss's fault. It's not his boss's fault. It's not his boss's fault. You know, it goes all the way back up to how insurance is structured in general. It's like, but if you ask any one of those individuals, well, do you think that's fair? They'll be like, well, no, of course not. That's not fair. You know, the system shouldn't work like that. But at the same time, there's this sort of, and this is what he means by big other, there's this other sort of ethos out there that is pushing us a certain kind of way, you know? So it doesn't matter what we say as a whole that, oh, I care about you as an individual or whatever. It doesn't matter because there's something else that exists as a structure that speaks through bureaucracy, this structure of disavowal that is the actual reality. You know what I mean? I don't know if that's what he means by the real, but that is the reality that's actually out there and affecting our lives. It doesn't matter how people feel about the situation if they can't act on it, you know?
Right.
The real is whatever supplants that reality. Yeah. So the real is like the actual intricate pieces of the bureaucracy. Like when you say, you know, why is my insurance going up when this other person hit me? Well, there's a lot of bureaucratic checks that go into that.
Right.
Like, you know, is the insurance company going to communicate with the other person's insurance company to find fault? That's a method of bureaucracy. These are all things that are bureaucratic steps that really alienate people from the process of what essentially they are doing. And this is just insurance. This is just a way that capitalism has told us, oh, this is just normal to mediate things this way.
Well, also, too, it's like staying on the insurance example, because I think this is a good one. It's like if, you know, you get an insurance or plan and they say, oh, if you break your windshield, your first windshield replacement is free, right? Well, that's not actually true because this actually happened to me. If your windshield breaks and they replace it, yes, it's free. You don't pay anything, but your insurance goes up $12 a month, which is a small amount. But then if you call them and you say, well, it's not my fault, blah, blah, why is my insurance, you know, going up $12 a month? There is a web of bureaucracy to legitimize it. You know, the bureaucracy is there, even though it's stupid and even though its sole purpose is to extract some more wealth out of the person under it. The bureaucracy adds a perceived legitimacy. It's a thing they can point to when you're upset that it happened. But now with that, my one critique of this section that Fisher outlines is the fact that he focuses explicitly on the bureaucracy that exists in the private sector because of privatization. But I also want to touch on the increased pointless bureaucracy that exists in the public sector because all of its infrastructure has been privatized and all that is left for it to exist and legitimize itself is bureaucracy. And so, like, if you take like a field like I work in, you know, urban planning, now, you know, urban planning under capitalist realism, under postmodern capitalism, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, it has no teeth. It has no funding and ability for it to say, we are going to put a high-speed rail system here. We are going to put a pedestrian crosswalk over all these dangerous intersections. We're going to, you know, provide affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The only thing it can do to legitimize itself and to continue to follow the laws and regulations and all that shit that are in place is to add increased bureaucracy and minutia within its master plans and all that stuff to be like, oh, we have this code over here and this thing over there to better bureaucratize our way into providing these services, or hope that they will, or add increased bureaucracy for the individual or the business to incentivize this type of thing, you know. But there is actual no there's no structural teeth or capacity for these institutions to any longer provide anything of material value.
Right.
And so the only thing they can do to basically make a name for themselves or make themselves seem like they're, doing what the task is of them,
Yeah.
serving the public, is just 300-page documents that mean nothing.
Right.
That can do actually nothing but make certain people's lives hell. You know?
Yeah, exactly. And I would say, I don't know, people listening to this pod and us included, I'm sure y'all have run into a free market theorist or a libertarian at some point who's said, it's all just voluntary. It's
Right.
all just voluntary trade and commerce and transactions. But, with this point of bureaucracy, I would actually argue that the intense bureaucracy under capitalism is actually just an indication of how coercive and how coerced the system is in general. And I think that's the point, the takeaway for our listeners, to understand, if you're getting confused by all this mention of bureaucracy, really just look at it as, the more bureaucracy in a society, the more there needs to be coercion and coerciveness in the system or the superstructure itself. So they kind of go hand in hand from my view.
I completely agree with that. And, with that said, we've kind of hashed out bureaucracy. We've introduced many different ways how capitalist realism affects a number of things materially. But, Matt, I know we were talking about this, and I want to turn this over to you to talk about, but how does Fisher link all of these concepts specifically to mental health, education, and capitalism at large?
Yeah. Well, in chapter 4, Fisher starts talking about a couple different things and linking education with mental health and capitalist realism. He talks about education becoming increasingly dominated by the imperatives of capitalist realism. And he brings up a case study, or more like an example of his time teaching in Britain. And he contrasts it with French students and how they're very passionate and political, whereas British students are more passive. They're very overcome with that inter-passivity. But he also introduces this concept that, for me, as someone with bipolar, as someone who suffers actively from depression, was very poignant and very stark. This idea of depressive hedonia, which is a state where people, or as Fisher describes it, a state where people can only pursue pleasure. They're so addled by the stress and the depression that they've suffered or dealt with that they can only pursue pleasure. And this was very important for me to read, because I feel like I've been stuck in sort of a cycle of, and I'm sure people listening to this can relate. You get on your phone, right? You get on Facebook. You're endlessly scrolling through memes just for that small dopamine hit. The chance to laugh, the chance to have something to share with your friends. And that is one example of the media apparatus, the technology apparatus that we're linked to. But what it showed me is that, this inter-passivity, this what he calls reflexive impotence, British students, for example, they've come to accept, as he describes it, their position, as we talked about, straddling between this, newfound freedom from the disciplinary institutions of high school into this role of now being a consumer of services. And this is the desert that we're left in. But this is how corporations and the superstructure have been allowed to really privatize the stress that capitalism itself creates and induces in people. So talking about the Thatcher quote that we mentioned before, there's no society, there's just individuals and families. This is really insidious, because what we're talking about here is the neoliberal cultural class project, or the cultural elements of it, getting us to privatize all these stresses as just okay, so this is, instead of it being a societal issue or a collective issue with just how our culture works and how our media works, it's become privatized, and it's become, incumbent upon the individual to look at it as like, okay, it's just my own personal chemical imbalance. It's just my own
Right.
personal need for medication, my own personal need for therapy. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about the privatization of stress.
Right.
The taking of a cultural, a societal sickness, and just making it out to be an individual issue. And with that comes along, I'm sure people can guess, profit for pharmaceutical companies,
Absolutely.
profit for therapists, profit for an entire industry of privatization of stress.
Yeah, there's no discussion about like how do we change the source of stress. It's all about like what are the
Exactly.
ways we can treat it, and it just happens to be that all the treatments cost money.
And this is another
it's a capital extraction
Yeah,
process.
this is another component of the capitalist realism, is that it's privatizing the stress rather than looking at alternative ways to mediate the stress. And that's where we go back to the concept of it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, because capitalism is privatizing everything. It's taking everything that we have collective responsibility towards and making it an individual responsibility, which is, it's so ass backwards and distorted and dissonant from reality that it's almost like insidious and sinister. We keep using those words, but there's no other way to describe the propaganda and the ideology of capitalism and what it does to people on a psychological, on a mental level.
He did talk pretty much at length about the education part of it, and sort of my main takeaway was that we've set these sort of like subjective markers that are supposed to be representative. He compares it, I think, at one point to Stalin once built a canal that wasn't actually big enough for any shipping or anything like that. But it was a nice thing to look at and say, well, we got something done. And I think he's kind of comparing this at one point to like education markers. We're looking at things like, well, how many students graduated? Okay, how many students failed? How many people are passing the standardized tests? And we're looking at those things, but we're not really looking at, are they actually getting a real experience of learning? How do those things actually relate to learning? You can imagine scenarios where they don't at all. We can imagine a scenario where we just let everybody graduate, but they actually haven't learned anything.
Right.
So he's sort of commenting on like how these bureaucratic structures will set goals for themselves that in reality are kind of easily achievable. They know they can reach them, but they might not actually affect the individual in a positive way.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to pull from that to add to your point, Nathan, is just a little bit of a quote. And with regards to the British students and reflexive impotence, Fisher says, and I quote, "They know that things are bad, but more than that, they know that they can't do anything about it. But that knowledge, that reflexivity, is not a passive observation of an already existing state of affairs. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy." And I think that is really what encapsulates the realism for me. It's like this realism of capital has supplanted our reality. It's created almost a new reality, a postmodern reality in a modern sense. Like I feel personally that we are still in a modern moment. We are not postmodern. You know what I mean? But it's made us think in terms of the fact that everything is, or this idea that everything is private, is individualized, atomized, alienated from everything. And that's not the way that society is. That's not the way that humans have evolved. We've evolved to be cooperative, and everything about our biology and the way that we are wired is in conflict with capitalist realism. So with that in mind, how does capitalist realism shift its failures onto the backs of the government?
Yeah, so, Fisher talks about a lot in sort of the last couple chapters about how one of the things he discusses is how capitalism is so good at what it does that even when it fails or causes a serious crisis of some kind, it's still able to convince, the public, or the people rather, that the failure is one of government. Like the failures of capitalism end up just sowing more distrust within, public institutions rather than the private ones that oftentimes created it. And so one example I think of, and he may use in the text, I can't remember, but when I think of the 2008 financial crisis, right? It's like you have this private real estate and finance sector, banking sector that goes rampant it collapses, destroys the entire world economy, sends tons of people unemployed, makes people homeless, rampant spikes in mental health issues, drug addiction, alcoholism, you name it, that we still have not recovered from to this day. And the response to that was not from the public, certainly from the left it was, but let's say the public at large was not, let's break up the big banks, or let's, we need a people's bailout or something like that. It was, how did the government allow this to happen? Why did this big, the government do this? Why did our public institutions do this? And then even the angst that was generated towards the private sector when they got bailed out, again, it was them being mad at the government, which rightfully so. I'm not giving any of the politicians a pass. They certainly deserve to be scrutinized, and they were all agents of the system that failed us. But
I think you said that they should be hung, remember?
Yeah.
You remember they should all be tried?
But the point being here is that you have a massive private sector failure.
Yeah.
And all that largely comes out in response is 2 years later, the Tea Party movement.
Yeah, I mean, even when people did blame the private sector, it was in very individual type circumstances.
Yeah, it was Jamie Dimon. It was Bernie Madoff.
$100 million bonuses in the year of the crash, or it was they had private jets to go testify to Congress about how they needed a bailout, and it's that's not the point. It's anybody in those seats. Anybody that was acting as a CEO was going to do the same thing no matter who got picked for that job. You know what I mean? It's not down to the individual. It's a systemic problem. And I think one thing that's really cool that he brings up in the book is sort of how we look at people above us and we say, when I get there, it's going to be different.
Right,
you know? But the truth is, we've all been there. Once you actually get the power, suddenly it's you have no energy to change these things because you're not the only one. Or you have
no ability.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the structure's still in place.
You're not the only one there. There's still that big other sitting in the chair with you that's no, this is how it has to work because that's how the insurance company charges you and that's how, police reports work and yada, yada, yada. It doesn't matter. There's this whole superstructure around you that's not going to let you change anything.
Right.
And if you try, it's just going to exhaust the shit out of you.
Yeah.
And so that's why the system, I think he uses the word petrifies itself. You know what I mean? You're subject to this sort of systemic petrification as you move up the ladder in the system,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so basically what Nathan's saying is if liberals think that they can change it from the inside, they're dead wrong.
Right.
But the final point that I would add to that is just I don't know if one of y'all mentioned it, but just the private, when private initiatives fail, government takes the blame.
Right.
For example, Flint, Michigan with the water crisis over there.
Exactly.
That's kind of the thing. It's and it happens kind of vice versa too. Now with COVID, everything is shifting onto the government to take care of it, to take care of us. When we're not in a crisis like this, though, the government is evil, and the government can do no right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it really can't do any right when it's run by right-wing psychopaths. But I mean, this is the thing about the subjectivity of capitalism and how it rests on the subjectively held beliefs. It's just at any moment, those beliefs or those values can change when circumstances or material conditions change. Libertarians, I'm sure before this COVID shit hit, were talking shit about the government or talking shit about all these things. And now all they can probably focus on is the stimulus checks, the unemployment checks. And it's just well, do you have any principles now that you're accepting money from the government? Do you have any self-awareness to admit now that your ideology doesn't work the way you thought it did? And this is the thing. It's just capitalism is dependent on subjective mythologized bullshit. And once you start breaking it down, it's impossible for a rational thinking person to really continue to believe in these ideologies, to believe in this mythology. But with that said, in the final chapter, Fisher discusses how the left needs to move on from its romantic attachments to a politics of failure, basically onto a politics of the future that we actually believe in. So what are the group's thoughts on this point? What might some examples be?
Yeah, so in this section, what Fisher's really trying to highlight is he kind of outlines in this whole text, what is capitalist realism? What is neoliberalism? What is, how does all this shit actually function? And then the last chapter, he talks about how, the left, though, plays into these same things. And the left isn't daring to dream up new ideas. It's really stuck in the past, whether it's, as his example is, well, we just go back to some sort of social democracy. Well, we just go back to some sort of traditional unionism. Well, if you talk about the radical left, like our peeps, let's rehash these stupid ass fucking debates between two dead 20th century communists that have no relevance or purpose to today.
Yeah.
And so for me, and what he talks about too is like the left has to be challenging the right on and the capitalist class on things that actually materially relate to ordinary people. So one thing he talks about is, the left needs to run on, let's put an end to useless bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Let's end it. You know what I mean? Let's do these kinds of things that we know affect ordinary people. But the problem with the left is they're, quite honestly, a bunch of kids playing in the sandbox with their, fucking Lenin and Trotsky figures, rehashing stupid ass debates that don't matter and playing pretend and then walking away from it when it doesn't materially matter to them anymore. And we're not creating any new ideas. And a book I just read actually by a conservative thinker, Ross Douthat, in his book, The Decadent Society, he talks about how, and he references Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, when Fisher talks about how capitalist realism, because it's not creating anything new, we're all just trapped in these cycles of nostalgia and repetition. And he talks about how because of this, in this decadent capitalist realist moment, we've seen this like return, especially in the Twitter sphere or the online sphere, on the right of a literal return to sort of fascism, and on the left, a literal return to archaic version of 20th century communism, namely Marxism-Leninism, that dominated the Third International. Two ideas that, quite frankly, are never going to return in their original form, but have dominated right and left radical sectors online because they think they're ahead of the game. They think they're truly, daring to struggle and daring to win, but in reality, they're just playing a part in this game of repetition.
Yeah,
and
that's
recycling.
already been kind of like set forth for them
and crushed.
Yeah, and already like it's already, you've already decided to go into one particular sect or dogma on the left, and it's already been kind of like the future of it's already been kind of hashed out for you. What are you going to do? LARP as like, someone with a new Shanka on and like a AK-47 in your profile pic on Facebook, and like that's going to do something. But I mean,
I'll have I have an anime profile pic. So.
I think the biggest takeaway for me from this book was just like we talked and described at length this concept of realism and like realism as like supplanting the reality or the objective reality that we're trying to, as leftists, as people with working within the scientific method, as Marxists trying to understand the world. Like capitalism itself as a society, like the societies that capitalism creates, are profoundly like illiterate. Like the way that we kind of just consume and the way that we kind of just feel our way through things, it's supremely like an illiterate society. And so the big thing that I've taken away from this book was that Mark Fisher's idea is that this is how pervasive capitalist realism is that it gets us to think of our own subjective fantasies as reality. It gets us to disavow things that are close to our ethics and our morals, while we can act with complete inter-passivity in a completely disavowed way from what we believe fundamentally. And the problem with that is that you don't fight that with LARPing online or fighting other sects, MLs or anarchists. You don't get that from dogpiling on people who believe 99.9% of the same things that you do.
Right.
You get progress by achieving some type of a political, like a coherent political platform in which your ideology, your propaganda supplants the realism that capitalism has created through its institutions, through its authority figures. These are the things that the left needs to focus on building, rather than squabbling for clout and clout mining on Twitter.
And I think that, it goes back to, at least for me, and when he's talking about this, the left being attached to these dead 20th century failures, and not letting up on them.
Well, yeah, not to say that there isn't any value in reading like Lenin or these people.
Or whoever. Yeah. But this, hyper sectarian focus on it, or as you said, like playing out these fantasies in their head that don't have any material relationship to the current moment. It's like, I think back to when we first originally, like, you and I met and just wanted to do this project was, how do we take these ideas and reshape them and reformulate them and educate people on them in a way that's modern and contemporary?
Right.
And what I want to see is a left that gets serious about modern material issues in a new way that isn't attached to recapitulating the old shit, and isn't super, attached to these abstract grand narratives and long historical debates. Get serious about shit that matters to average people and breaks from this capitalist realist nonsense that is literally sending us spiraling towards the end of civilization.
Right. And then I'm sure we'll do an episode on it at some point, but really I think what you need to contrast this capitalist realism with is this concept of hegemony. Like, would capitalist realism or this like false reality that we live in be possible without systems of hegemony and bureaucracy, authority? Like, would these things be possible in the way they are? No, I don't think so. And so what that leaves us with is we need to navigate out of this capitalist realism miasma, which is this all-consuming idea that capitalism is the default. We need to supplant that with a way that socialism becomes the default. Like, we need to do this in a cultural way and get people to think, okay, culturally, socialism should be the default. Mm-hmm. And that's what the left needs to work on. And the way we do that, like in a concrete way, is to get authority figures, to get bureaucracy, to get hegemony, to get control of these things. And really, there's no way around it. Like, the way to establish hegemony and control, under capitalism is revolution, right? We've talked about that before, but it's like, it doesn't necessarily have to be violent. It doesn't necessarily have to be bloody
or undemocratic.
But at the same time, like, you can't supplant this realism of capital without like a profoundly better like cultural socialism. Like, we need a culture of socialism where it supplants these ideas and becomes the new default.
Mm-hmm. I think kind of as my final note here, it's just that this is becoming more and more detrimental that we get this conversation started now, because as Mark Fisher points out in the book, almost half the people alive today have never actually existed in the same time where something besides capital was a real existing thing.
Right.
The Berlin Wall fell in 1989.
Right.
We're approaching the point where entire generations have never witnessed anything besides capitalism. So as it goes on, this capitalist realism just starts to reinforce itself more and more. And I think it sort of begs the question, like, is there a time limit to where this actually has to change now, or we're all just going to be stuck in this forever?